For a little bit more on this, we're now joined via Zoom by Professor Ingrid Woolard, who's a contributor to the Stellenbosch Business School's 2022 Women's Report. Thanks so much indeed for joining us. Welcome to the program. What inspired this particular study?
So I think everyone in South Africa knows that we have this very, very large system of social grants. But I think where perhaps there's been insufficient attention is on the gender dimension. And so what we find in the report is that 96% of child support grants get paid to women, and about 60% of old age pensions go to women. And so that's a really important aspect in terms of being a reliable source of income that gets paid every month. Even though these are small amounts of money, they do make a significant difference to South African women. And I think that's something that perhaps is underplayed. There's so much attention around the cost of these grants, but perhaps insufficient attention to the fact that they do go quite a long way to narrowing the gender poverty gap.
All right, tell us about how these women are empowered, because this is what we were talking about in the intro.
Yes, so there's now quite a big body of evidence which shows that households that receive a grant are more likely to have women that are actively seeking work. And that might seem somewhat counterintuitive. You'd think, well, they're getting grants, so why are they? Why does that in fact encourage work seeking? And so what we think happens there is that by knowing that you have this reliable source of income each month, it means that you do then have the cash available, for example, to ask somebody else to look after your children, or to fund taxi fare, etc., when you go and look for work. So that's an interesting dimension, that in fact, because you know that you have this reliable source of income, it in fact frees you up in some ways from financial and childcare responsibilities, and perhaps makes it easier to search for work.
I don't know if this is anecdotal, but I've seen often studies where when funds are given to women, there's a greater responsibility at how that money is spent than if the same funds are given to men.
Yes, so there's a big international literature on that. And in fact, when the child support grant was being designed back in 1998, the panel under Francie Lund, who chaired the Lund Commission, they were very influenced by that aspect, by the fact that there is this evidence all over the world which shows that if you put money into the hands of women, it's more likely to be spent on food, it's more likely to be spent on school uniforms, and we know that children in those households are more likely to have good nutritional outcomes and stay in school for longer. So that is a really important dimension that you're mentioning there, Peter.
All right, so tell us about some of these things that are not backed up by evidence, as your report states, that pregnancies are encouraged by the fact that if they've got a kid, they're going to get these grants. How were you able to ascertain whether this was true or not?
So that is a good question. And of course, that we all do have anecdotal evidence of course, there are some people who will perhaps get pregnant in order to access the grant. But the broader literature on this suggests that, in fact, there doesn't seem to be a strong link between pregnancy and the grants. So there are three aspects to this. The first is that we've, in fact, seen a decline in fertility, and particularly teenage fertility, over the past 20 years. So the child support grant has been there since 1998, and in the 24 years since 1998, fertility in this country, in fact, has been declining. So that's the first bit of evidence which suggests that there isn't a strong relationship between fertility and the grants. The second part of the story is particularly interesting, and that is that teenage mothers are the group least likely to collect the child support grant, to apply for the child support grant on behalf of their child. And so that's an interesting piece of the puzzle, because if that group are much less likely than older women to collect the grant, then that strongly suggests that the grant itself wasn't the original incentive to have a child. And so I think, one needs to think more broadly about what is it that's driving teenage pregnancy in South Africa. And the evidence seems to strongly suggest that it's around poor sex education, it's around lack of access to contraception, and it's around risky behaviors. So I think we need to move the attention on to trying to address those issues rather than blaming the grants.
What else did you find in this report? What comes to the fore as well?
So one of the other aspects is that we unpack a little bit in the report is the fact that women that receive grants are more likely to belong to stokvels, and they're more likely to engage in other sorts of community activities. So it seems that there's something about having this small amount of money that you can call your own, which seems to promote some sort of agency and independence amongst women. But it also seems to encourage social cohesion in terms of encouraging women to come together, for example, in savings clubs. And so I think that's another aspect of this. It does seem to grant women some type of agency, but also to promote social cohesion.
This report's been coming out year after year. Are you starting to see themes that have developed over time and other themes that are either increasing or decreasing? What are you seeing with the lay of the land?
So the Women's Report each year chooses a different focus. So this year it focused specifically on fiscal policy, but in other years it takes on a different focus. So the aim of the publication is always to look at what is it that we can say about women in the world of work, and we conceptualize work quite broadly in that way. But each year we try and take a different angle in terms of thinking about how are women being further empowered within the South African workplace.
So what do the policymakers do with this information?
So I do think that policymakers in South Africa actually are quite close to the research process. I think it is a space in which we do certainly often have the ear of government. We do have a government which takes cognizance of information such as that which we've put out in this report. So I do think that the South African story around social security is a very positive story in terms of the post-apartheid government. We've been highly successful in redistributing large amounts of cash, but I think one needs to take cognizance of the fact that grants are not the silver bullet. They're one aspect of a much broader developmental strategy that we need for South Africa. We can't just continue to rely on our ability to hand out small amounts of cash. We also need to know that when children attend school, they're attending quality schools. We need to know that if children develop skills, that they will one day be able to enter the labor market. So I think one needs to think about this in a coherent way in terms of thinking about broader economic and social policy within South Africa.
Professor Woolard, it's been great talking to you. Thanks so much indeed for sharing the insights from this report. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. All right, that's Professor Ingrid Woolard, who's a contributor to the Stellenbosch Business School's 2022